The morning they shut down an $8 million construction project, nobody was yelling. That's the part people always expect me to exaggerate, like there had to be some big screaming match or cops everywhere or me standing there acting tough with my arms crossed like some movie scene. But honestly, the loudest thing that morning was a cement mixer idling in place while 20 grown men stared at a fence that wasn't supposed to be there. And the crazy part is, that fence was sitting exactly where it had always belonged. See, my name's Daniel Mercer, and for almost 17 years I owned this awkward little piece of commercial land on the east side of Clearwater Ridge, just outside Nashville. Not prime real estate, not glamorous, nothing anybody would post online with drone shots and motivational music. It was an old rectangular lot with a faded storage building, a gravel driveway full of potholes, and enough empty space behind it for me to keep old equipment and trailers from the contracting business I used to run with my brother before he passed. Most people driving by probably thought it was forgettable, which, honestly, was fine by me. I liked forgettable. Forgettable means people leave you alone. But then the city started growing. Fast. One by one, old auto shops and warehouses got torn down and replaced with these polished retail developments full of chain coffee places and luxury gyms where everybody somehow looked like they'd just finished a photo shoot. Property values shot up overnight. Suddenly, everybody wore loafers and carried rolled-up blueprints like they were born doing it. And right next to my property, this development company called Hallbrook Urban Partners bought 3 adjoining lots and announced a huge mixed-use expansion project. Offices downstairs, condos upstairs, trendy restaurants, rooftop patio, all the usual stuff developers promise before they destroy traffic forever. At first, I honestly didn't care. Their land was their land. Mine was mine. End of story. Or at least that's what I thought. The first weird thing happened maybe 3 months into construction. I came by early one Tuesday to grab some equipment and noticed stacks of steel framing sitting unusually close to my western boundary. Not over it. Just close. Close enough that I stopped walking and stared at it for a second. Now, most people wouldn't notice something like that. But when you own property long enough, especially commercial property, you get weirdly aware of space. You know where every crack in the pavement is. You know where the drainage dips after rain. You know exactly where your land ends because taxes make sure you never forget. So I looked at those steel stacks and thought, that's new. But I let it go. Construction sites are chaotic. Stuff moves around. I figured some subcontractor parked materials wherever was convenient, and nobody thought twice about it. Then a week later, I noticed spray paint markings across the dirt behind their retaining wall. Bright orange layout lines cutting angles into the ground. And one of those lines crossed directly over one of my old survey pins. That made my stomach tighten a little. Not panic, just that quiet feeling you get when something isn't right yet. That night, I pulled out my original property documents from a filing cabinet in the storage office. I still had the old survey from 2008 folded inside a weathered envelope with my late father's handwriting on the front. He was the one who taught me never to trust memory when paperwork exists. People lie, he used to say, but measurements don't. I spread the survey across my desk and checked every dimension again. Same numbers, same markers, same boundary. Nothing had changed, which meant one thing. Their layout ignored it completely. Still, I didn't storm over there. I know people online love those revenge stories where somebody immediately starts cussing out construction workers and throwing legal threats around like confetti, but real life doesn't work that way. Most problems get worse because people react too fast. So instead, I started documenting. Quietly. Every morning before work, I'd stop by with coffee and take photos from the same angles. I recorded timestamps, measured distances from the survey pins, even made notes about which crews were working what sections. And over the next several days, things got harder to explain away. Wooden forms appeared directly over the line. Rebar cages got tied into place on my side of the property. Concrete trucks started backing into areas that legally didn't belong to them. That's when I realized this wasn't some careless mistake from a worker making $12 an hour. Somebody higher up had approved those plans. Somebody looked at those boundaries and decided my land was close enough to theirs that they could just absorb a few feet and keep moving. And honestly, I think they assumed I'd stay quiet because my property looked old and theirs looked expensive. That happens more than people admit. Folks see enough money and machinery, and they start acting like ownership is just a suggestion. A few days later, I finally met the site manager. Tall guy, probably mid-40s, perfect haircut, spotless boots that had clearly never touched wet concrete in their life. His name was Eric Voss. I caught him near the trailers while crews were unloading piping. I kept things polite. "Hey," I said, "I think your foundation layout crossed onto my property." He barely looked up from his tablet. "Nah," he said casually. "We checked everything." That little "nah" irritated me way more than if he'd actually argued. I told him I had surveys proving otherwise. He smiled. Not friendly either. More like the kind of smile people use when they already decided you're inconvenient. "Look," he said, "these projects go through engineering, legal, city review. There's a lot behind this stuff. You probably just haven't seen the updated site plans." Updated site plans. Like my property line was some software update I forgot to install. I remember staring at him for a second thinking, this guy really believes confidence beats ownership. Then he gave me this tiny shrug and said, "We're not worried about it." After Eric told me they weren't worried about it, I sat in my truck for maybe 10 minutes just staring through the windshield while crews kept moving behind the fence like nothing happened. And I'll be honest with you, part of me almost let it go. Not because they were right, but because fighting people with money is exhausting before it even starts. These developers had attorneys, engineers, city relationships, investors. Me? I had an aging storage building, a filing cabinet full of surveys, and a blood pressure problem my doctor kept warning me about. But the more I thought about that conversation, the more something about it crawled under my skin. It wasn't arrogance exactly. It was dismissal, like I was already erased from the equation. That hit harder than I expected. See, after my brother died, I kept that property mostly because it was the last thing in my life that still felt stable. My ex-wife used to say I treated that land like a graveyard, and maybe she wasn't entirely wrong. Every corner of it carried memories. We built the storage building together. My dad helped pour the slab himself back in the 90s. Hell, there were still grease stains behind the shop from old engine rebuilds we did 20 years ago. So when somebody casually decided they could shave off part of it because their blueprint demanded more space, it stopped being a property issue in my head. It felt personal. The next morning, I called a licensed surveyor named Walter Green. Older guy, late 60s probably, looked like he'd spent 40 years arguing with trees and winning. Real old-school Tennessee surveyor, suspenders, sunburned neck, carried himself like somebody who trusted steel tape measures more than computers. When I explained the situation, he got quiet for a second and said, "If they already poured footings before verifying boundary pins, somebody got cocky." That word stuck with me. Cocky. Walter showed up 2 days later before sunrise. The construction crews weren't there yet, just a few security lights glowing over stacks of materials. I walked the property with him while he unpacked equipment from this beat-up white truck that looked older than I was. He barely talked while he worked. Just checked measurements, marked reference points, stared through his scope, wrote numbers down in a weatherproof notebook. Every once in a while he'd mutter things under his breath like, "Well, I'll be damned," which, coming from a surveyor, sounded terrifying. Around 8 in the morning, crews started arriving. You could feel the energy shift immediately once they realized someone was officially surveying the line. Workers slowed down. Foremen started whispering. A couple guys stood on unfinished concrete forms watching us like we were defusing a bomb. Then Eric showed up. Same spotless boots. Same tablet tucked under his arm. He walked over smiling like this was all some minor misunderstanding that would disappear if he stayed confident enough. "Morning," he said. Walter didn't even acknowledge him. Just kept measuring. That drove Eric crazy almost immediately. "What exactly are we doing here?" he asked me. I said, "Confirming property lines." He gave this fake chuckle. "We already did that months ago." Walter finally looked up and said, "Then whoever did it screwed up." Man, the silence after that was incredible. Eric's face tightened instantly. "Excuse me." Walter pointed toward one of the foundation corners. "You're over approximately 4 feet, maybe a little more near the rear angle." Eric actually laughed. Loud. Like the idea itself was ridiculous. "That's impossible." Walter shrugged. "Land doesn't care what's possible." I swear I almost smiled hearing that. But the real turning point came about an hour later when Walter finished re-establishing the entire line using the original county coordinates. Bright orange stakes went into the ground one by one, connected by flagged string running straight through the center of their prepared foundation section. Not near it. Through it. dead through it, like somebody sliced the project in half with a knife. Suddenly, all the swagger disappeared. Workers stopped moving equipment. One concrete driver literally climbed down from his truck and just stood there staring. Eric started making phone calls immediately, pacing circles near the trailers. By noon, 2 more people arrived in expensive SUVs, lawyers or project executives, maybe both. One woman introduced herself as Dana Holloway, Regional Operations Director. She had that polished corporate comm people use when they're trying very hard not to sound panicked. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "there appears to be a discrepancy." A discrepancy? I almost laughed in her face. Walter handed her the survey paperwork without saying a word. She studied it for maybe 30 seconds before asking if there was room for practical adjustment. Practical adjustment. That was the phrase. Not apology. Not acknowledgement. Adjustment. Like ownership was negotiable if enough money stood nearby. I told her there wouldn't be any adjustments. Then Eric jumped back in. "Daniel, come on," he said, trying to sound friendly now. "We're talking about a few feet." I looked him dead in the face and said, "Funny how it's always the other guy's few feet." One of the workers nearby actually snorted, trying not to laugh. Eric shot him a look sharp enough to kill grass. The next few days got tense. Real tense. Construction slowed around the disputed section while engineers scrambled to review plans. I started noticing people watching my property constantly. Survey crews came and went. Attorneys walked the line taking photos. Somebody from the city inspector's office stopped by twice. But here's the thing nobody tells you about situations like this. Once confidence cracks, everything changes. The developers had spent months acting like the project was unstoppable. Now suddenly, every decision looked rushed. Every measurement got questioned. Every subcontractor started protecting themselves. Nobody wanted to be the guy blamed for building illegally onto private land. And that's when I decided to make sure the boundary became impossible to ignore. I hired a fencing company out of Franklin and told them I wanted a temporary commercial barrier installed directly on the surveyed line. Heavy-duty steel posts. Reinforced panels. No gaps. No ambiguity. The owner of the fencing company actually asked me twice if I was serious because the line literally cut through active construction forms. "Right through the middle?" he asked. I said, "Exactly through the middle." The barrier went up on a Thursday afternoon. I stood there watching section after section get anchored into place while workers across the site pretended not to stare. And honestly, seeing that fence rise out of the dirt felt strangely emotional. Not triumphant exactly. More like watching somebody finally say out loud what should have been obvious the whole time. This land stops here. The next morning was absolute chaos. I got there around 6:30 and construction vehicles were already backed up near the entrance. Crews clustered around the fence drinking coffee and pointing. The concrete pour scheduled for that morning had been canceled because the barrier physically blocked access to half the foundation section. One side of the project was legal. The other side suddenly belonged to a lawsuit waiting to happen. Around 7, Eric stormed toward me so fast I thought he might actually lose his mind right there in the mud. "You seriously put up a damn fence?" he snapped. "On my property," I said calmly. "You crippled the whole site." "No," I told him. "Your survey team did that." He got close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath. "Do you have any idea how much money this delay is costing?" And there it was. Not concern over boundaries. Not concern over legality. Money. I remember looking past him at the stalled equipment, the unfinished forms, the workers standing around waiting for instructions, and realizing something almost funny. For months they acted like my land was invisible, but now suddenly every inch of it mattered more than anything on that site. Dana showed up about 30 minutes later, far less polished this time. She pulled me aside near the trailers and tried a different approach. Softer voice. Sympathetic tone. "Daniel," she said quietly, "there has to be a reasonable solution here." I told her there already was. Respect property lines before building across them. She sighed and rubbed her forehead like I was being difficult. Then she offered to purchase the disputed strip immediately. Cash. Fast close. No litigation. And honestly, for a split second, I considered it. The number she mentioned wasn't small. But then I looked over at that fence running straight through their project and thought about my dad's handwriting on that old survey envelope. I thought about Eric saying they weren't worried about it. And something inside me just locked into place. I shook my head. "No," I said. "Now you have to redesign it." Dana stared at me for a long second after that. Not angry, almost impressed, like she'd finally realized I wasn't negotiating anymore. For about 3 weeks after that, the entire site felt cursed. That's the only way I can describe it. Every time I drove past, something had changed again. Crews tearing out forms they'd just installed. Engineers walking around with rolled-up revisions under their arms. Delivery trucks getting redirected because half the access lane no longer worked with the fence cutting through the middle of everything. And the craziest part was, none of it had to happen. That's what kept sitting in the back of my mind. All of this chaos, all this money burning by the hour, all these meetings and redesigns and legal reviews, because somebody decided 4 feet of another man's property wasn't worth respecting. One afternoon, Walter stopped by while I was cleaning out the storage building and leaned against the doorway watching the site across the road. "You know," he said, "most people fold once developers start pushing." I asked him why. He shrugged. "Because big projects make people feel small." That line stayed with me. Because honestly, he was right. There's this strange psychological thing that happens when you're standing near cranes and concrete pumps and giant corporate signage. You start feeling like the future already made its decision and you're just standing in the way of it. I think that's exactly what Hallbrook Urban Partners counted on. They figured I'd see all that momentum and convince myself resistance was pointless. And maybe 10 years earlier they would have been right. But grief changes people. Losing my brother changed me. Losing my marriage changed me. Somewhere along the line, I stopped needing other people to think I was reasonable all the time. And that turned out to be dangerous for them. Eventually, the revised plans came through. They had no choice. The county wouldn't approve continuation until the boundary issue was resolved, and since I refused to sell, the entire western section of the expansion had to be redesigned inward. What was originally supposed to be one seamless retail corridor now had this awkward recessed section carved out near my property. You could literally see where the project bent around the line they tried to ignore. It looked expensive, because it was. Rumors started floating around town after that. Small towns love drama, especially expensive drama. Some people said I'd cost the developers over $1 million in delays and redesigns. Others claimed they deserved worse. A local Facebook group somehow turned the whole thing into a community debate about greedy landowners versus corporate overreach. One lady called me an obstacle to progress. Another guy commented that developers were parasites with blueprints. It became entertainment for people who had nothing to do with it. Meanwhile, I was still just showing up to my dusty little property every morning drinking gas station coffee out of the same thermos I'd had for years. Then one evening, right before sunset, Eric showed up alone. No lawyers, no executives, no polished confidence. Just him standing outside the fence with his hands in his jacket pockets looking tired for the first time since I met him. I walked over expecting another argument, but instead he just stared at the construction site for a while and said, "You really weren't bluffing." I laughed a little. "Neither were you." He nodded once like he hated admitting that. There was this long silence between us where machinery clanged in the distance and workers shouted somewhere near the loading area. Then he looked at me and said something I honestly didn't expect. "You know what the problem was?" I shrugged. He kicked at the gravel near his boots. We got used to people giving in. That hit me harder than I thought it would, because it was probably the first honest thing anybody from that company had said since this whole mess started. He told me projects like theirs constantly ran into minor encroachments during development. Easements, setback issues, tiny property conflicts. Usually they just paid somebody off quietly or pressured cities into variances. According to him, most owners eventually took the money because fighting delayed everything. And when people see enough zeros, he said, they start convincing themselves principles are flexible. I remember looking at the half-finished building behind him and saying, maybe that's the real problem. He smirked at that, not sarcastic this time, just tired. Then he asked me something that honestly still annoys me because I've thought about it 100 times since. He said, if I'd handled that first conversation differently, would any of this have happened? Man, I didn't answer right away, because truthfully, maybe not. If he'd walked over that first day and said, hey, let's double-check this before we continue, there's a decent chance we would have solved the entire thing quietly in a week. No fence, no shutdown, no redesign, no public embarrassment. But arrogance has a way of escalating situations that common sense could solve in 10 minutes. So finally I told him, The land was never the real issue. He looked confused for a second, then nodded slowly like he understood exactly what I meant. After that, things cooled off. The fence stayed up until the revised foundation passed inspection. Then eventually, I had it removed and replaced with permanent steel boundary markers sunk deep into the ground. Bigger than before. Impossible to miss. The project finally got completed almost a year later. And every single time I drive past it, I notice the same thing. That strange recessed gap along the western edge where the building bends awkwardly around my property line. Most people probably don't even think about it. To them, it's just architecture. But I see the scar underneath it. I see the moment somebody assumed ownership only mattered when convenient. Funny enough, I still get recognized around town sometimes because of that whole situation. A guy at Home Depot once looked at me and said, "Hey, you're the fence guy." Like I'm some local folk legend who fought a skyscraper with paperwork and stubbornness. And honestly, maybe that's exactly what happened. But here's the part people argue about whenever I tell this story. Some folks think I should have just taken the money. They say progress matters more than pride. Others think I did the only reasonable thing and protected what legally belonged to me. Truth is, I still don't fully know. Because sometimes late at night, I wonder whether I defended my property or whether I was really defending the last piece of my old life that nobody had managed to take away yet. Maybe those are the same thing. Maybe they aren't. But I do know this. Boundaries only matter if people are willing to enforce them. Otherwise, they're just lines on paper waiting for somebody louder to ignore them. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have sold the land and moved on? Or would you have stopped the entire project too? Let me know in the comments, because I've heard both sides of this argument for years now, and honestly, people get surprisingly heated about a few feet of dirt.